Hannibal's War by Livy. Book 22. 1. Spring was now approaching, and so Hannibal emerged from his winter quarters. His earlier attempt to cross the Apennines had been thwarted by the unbearably cold weather, and the waiting period had been very dangerous and fraught with fear. The Gauls had been induced to revolt by hopes of plunder and booty, but now they saw that instead of taking loot and spoils from the territory of others, their own lands were the theatre of war, and they were burdened with providing winter quarters for the armies of both sides. They therefore transferred their animosity from the Romans back to Hannibal. He had often been a target of the plots of Gallic chieftains, but he had been saved from them by the Gauls' own treachery to each other, since they betrayed a conspiracy as easily as they had formed it. He had also protected himself against their plots by confusing them with various changes of clothing and headgear. But the fear of such plots was a further reason for his hasty move from his winter quarters. It was about this time, on 15th of March, that the consul Gnaeus Servilius entered office in Rome. When Servilius opened discussion of the current state of affairs, the senators' resentment towards Gaius Flaminius resurfaced. They had elected 2 consuls, they said, but had just one. What legal or religious sanction did Flaminius have for his authority? Magistrates took that authority with them from home. When they left the state and their own hearths, only after celebrating the Latin festival, performing the sacrifice on the Alban Mount, and making vows in accordance with ritual on the capital auspices, did not go with a private individual. They said, nor could someone who had left without them take them for the first time in a foreign land. Fears were heightened by prodigies that were simultaneously reported from several places. In Sicily, the spears of a number of soldiers had burst into flames, and this also happened in Sardinia to a staff that a horseman had been holding in his hand while he was doing the rounds of the sentries on the wall. In Sardinia, too, beaches had been lit up with numerous fires. 2 shields had oozed blood, a number of soldiers had been struck by lightning, and the sun's orb appeared to have grown smaller. At Praeneste, burning stones had fallen from the sky. At Erpi, shields had been seen in the sky, and the sun seemed to be fighting with the moon. At Capena, 2 moons had arisen during the daytime. The waters at Caere had flowed mixed with blood, and the spring of Hercules itself had streaks of blood in its flow. In the region of Antium, harvesters found that bloody ears of wheat had fallen into their baskets. At Falerii, a huge fissure seemed to appear in the sky, and a blinding light shone out from the opening. The oracular lots had spontaneously shrunk in size, and one of them fell out bearing the words, "Mars is brandishing his spear." During this same period, in Rome, sweat appeared on the statue of Mars on the Appian Way, and on the figures of the wolves at Cupola. The sky appeared to be on fire, and the moon seemed to fall during a rain shower. Then less spectacular prodigies also won belief. Some people's goats growing wool, and a hen turning into a cock, and vice versa. These signs were brought to the Senate's attention just as they had been reported, along with the individuals who had witnessed them, and the consul sought the senators' opinions on the appropriate rites to be observed. Their decision was that full-grown animals should be used for the expiation of some prodigies, and suckling animals for others, and that there be a 3-day period of public prayers at all the couches of the gods. For the rest, the decemvirs were to study the books, and such measures were to be taken as the decemvirs interpreted as pleasing to the gods on the basis of the holy verses. Following the advice of the decemvirs, the Senate decided that, in the first instance, a gift of a 50-pound thunderbolt of gold be made to Jupiter, and gifts of silver to Juno and Minerva. Sacrifices of full-grown victims were to be made to Queen Juno on the Aventine and to Juno Suspita at Lanuvium. In addition, the married women were to gather together as much money as each could afford, and bear it a gift to Queen Juno on the Aventine, where the lectisternium was also to be held. Even freedwomen were required to contribute money, according to their means, for a gift of Feronia. When all this was done, the decemvirs held a sacrifice of full-grown victims in the forum at Ardea. Finally, when December came round, a sacrifice was offered at the temple of Saturn in Rome. Orders were issued for the lectisternium, which the senators conducted, and there was a public feast. Throughout the city, for a day and a night, the cry Saturnalia went up, and the people were instructed to keep the day as a holiday, which they were to observe ever after. 2. While the consul was busy at Rome with ceremonies of propitiation and with the mobilization of troops, Hannibal had left his winter quarters. Word had come to him that the consul Flaminius had reached Arretium, and so, although he was shown an easier but longer route, he took the shorter path through the marshes of the river Arno, which at the time was unusually high. Hannibal directed the Spaniards and Africans, the very best of his veteran troops, to lead the line of march, taking their baggage within their ranks so they would not lack vital supplies if compelled to halt at any stage. He ordered the Gauls to follow them and form the center of the column, while the cavalry were to be in the last position. Finally, Mago and the light-armed Numidians were to bring up the rear. Mago had the special charge of keeping the Gauls in check, preventing them from slipping away or stopping if they tired of the long and grueling journey. Gauls as a race, having little tolerance for hardships of the kind, the troops in front simply followed the lead of the guides, and they managed to keep up through the deep and almost bottomless morasses left by the river, despite being almost swallowed up by the mud and submerged in water. But the Gauls were unable to remain on their feet once they stumbled, or to extricate themselves from the deep holes. Their spirit could not sustain their strength, nor hope their spirit. Some, physically exhausted, had difficulty dragging themselves along, and others, their spirit broken from fatigue, simply collapsed and perished amongst the beasts of burden that themselves lay dying all around. Most debilitating of all was the sleeplessness they endured for 4 days and 3 nights. Everything was covered with water, and finding a dry spot to set down their wearied limbs was impossible, and so they would pile their baggage packs together in the water and lie down on them, or the cadavers or pack animals that were strewn in heaps all along their path provided as much of a bed as they needed. Gross. All they sought was something above water that would give them a moment's sleep. As for Hannibal himself, he had been suffering from an eye infection since the inclement spring weather with its alternating hot and cold temperatures, and now he rode on one surviving elephant to keep himself higher above the water. However, the sleep deprivation, the damp nights, and the swampy atmosphere all had a bad effect on his head, and since there was no place and no time for treatment, he went blind in one eye. 3. Many men and pack animals had died horrible deaths by the time Hannibal finally emerged from the marshes, and he took the first possible opportunity of encamping on dry land. Here he was informed by scouts that the Roman army was close to the walls of Arretium. He thereupon produced, with a very thorough and detailed enquiry into the consul's strategy and way of thinking, into the geography and routes of the area and its capability of providing supplies, and into everything else that it was valuable for him to know. The area, the Etruscan plains lying between Faesulae and Arretium, was amongst the most fertile in Italy, well blessed with grain, livestock, and all other commodities. The consul had become headstrong as a result of his earlier consulship, having no respect not just for the laws and the Senate, but even for the gods. His natural recklessness had been further nourished by good luck, which had secured him success in civilian and in military life. It was therefore perfectly clear that Flaminius would have no regard for God or man, and that his conduct would be characterized throughout by arrogance and lack of caution. And to make him more ready to yield to his natural defects, the Carthaginian was preparing to stimulate him and stir him into action. Leaving his enemy to the left, Hannibal made for Faesulae, and went on to conduct raids in central Etruria. There, with slaughter and burning, he provided the consul with a distant spectacle of as much devastation as he could. Even his enemy had remained inactive. Flaminius would not have remained inactive himself, and now he saw allied property hauled off and pillaged almost before his eyes. He took it as a personal insult that the Carthaginian was meandering through central Italy and meeting no opposition as he advanced to launch an assault on the very walls of Rome. In council, everybody else was advocating a prudent rather than a flamboyant course of action. They should await Flaminius's colleagues, they suggested, so as to have combined forces and an unified plan and strategy for the campaign, and in the meantime use their cavalry and light infantry to curb the unchecked raiding of the enemy. Furious, Flaminius stormed out of the council and put up the signal simultaneously for marching and engaging the enemy. "Why, yes," he said, "let us just sit before the walls of Arretium. This is where our home and our hearths are. Let us have Hannibal slip through our fingers and make a thorough job of pillaging Italy. Let him reach the walls of Rome, looting and burning everything on his way, and let us not move from here until the senators summon Gaius Flaminius from Arretium, as once they did Camillus from Veii." With this snide remark, he gave the order for the standards to be quickly pulled from the ground, and he himself leaped onto his horse. But the horse suddenly took a stumble, throwing the consul over its head. All the bystanders were terrified at this apparently dreadful omen for the start of the campaign, but to add to it, word was brought that despite the standard-bearers' greatest efforts, one of the standards could not be pulled out of the ground. That's fucking ridiculous. Give me a break. Flaminius turned to the messenger. It is not as if you are bringing me a letter from the Senate forbidding me to engage, is it? He asked. If the man's hand is too numb with fear to pull it up, go back and tell them to dig up the standard. With that, the column began to move forward. The officers, as well as disagreeing with Flaminius' strategy, were also dismayed by the twofold portent, but the rank and file in general were delighted with their commander's determination. They felt optimism without asking themselves what it was based on. 4. Hannibal completely razed the territory between the city of Corona and Lake Trasimene, using all the atrocities of war to sharpen his foe's resentment and spur him to avenge the injuries inflicted on his allies. The Carthaginians had by now reached a spot naturally suited to an ambush, the area where Trasimene is at its closest to the mountains of Cortona. Between the two there is no more than a narrow pathway, almost as if just enough space had been deliberately left for Hannibal's purpose. After this, the terrain widens a little to form a plain, and beyond that rise some hills. It was there, in the open, that Hannibal established camp. He intended to take up a position in this spot himself, but only with his African and Spanish troops. The Balearic troops and other light infantry he led behind the hills, and the cavalry he stationed right at the entry to the defile, where some hillocks conveniently provided cover. His plan was for the cavalry to block the defile after the Romans had entered, and the whole enemy force would then be shut in between the lake and the mountains. Flaminius had reached the lake at the sunset of one day, and when it was barely light on which followed, he went through the defile without reconnoitring. What the fuck is that? reconnoitring. 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 Sure, whatever. Okay. Flaminius had reached the lake at the sunset of one day, and when it was barely light on that which followed, he went through the defile without reconnoitring. Then, after the column began to spread out, as it reached the more open terrain, all he saw of the enemy was what was right ahead of him. The ambush to his rear and above his head remained undetected. The Carthaginian now had his enemy where he had wanted him, squeezed between lake and hills and surrounded by the troops, and so he gave all his units the signal for a simultaneous attack. These swooped down, each taking the shortest route to the enemy. The attack was all the more surprising and unexpected for the Romans because of a mist which had risen from the lake and which had settled more densely on the level ground than on the heights. As a result, the enemy columns had been quite visible to each other from the various hills, and had better synchronized their downward charge. When the cry went up on every side, the Romans realized they were surrounded before they could actually see it, and fighting broke out at the front and on the flanks before the line could be drawn up, weapons made ready or swords drawn. 5. There was chaos all around, but the consul himself showed considerable composure in such a precarious situation. The ranks were in disarray, as men turned in the direction of the confused shouts, but he formed them up as well as time and in their position permitted. Wherever he could, and whenever he could make himself heard, he encouraged them and told them to stand and fight. They needed force and courage to get out of there, he said, not prayers and petitions to the gods. It was by the sword that a way could be made through the midst of the enemy line, and in general, less fear meant less danger. But over the din and turmoil of battle, advice and orders were inaudible. So far from recognizing their own standards or their ranks and their places within them, they had barely the presence of mind to seize their armor and put it on for the fight. In fact, some were cut down when their weapons proved more a hindrance than a means of protection. Furthermore, in such dense fog, ears were more useful than eyes. It was to sounds that they turned their faces and eyes, to sounds of wounds being dealt, of blows falling on bodies and armor, and of the mingled cries of confusion and panic. Some tried to flee, only to be brought back to a halt when ran into batches of comrades still fighting, while others who were returning to the fray could be driven back by a crowd in flight. Attempts to force a passage in any direction proved futile. They were hemmed in on the banks by the hills and the lake, and to the front and rear by lines of the enemy. It became clear that they had no hope of deliverance except by their own right hands and their swords, and at that point each man became his own leader and spurred himself to action, and the battle started all over again. It was not the usual ordered engagement with Principes, Hastati, and Triari, or with the men of the front rank fighting before the standards and the rest behind, or with soldiers taking their places in the appropriate legion, cohort, or maniple. Chance threw them together, and individual courage determined whether each man stood in front or behind in the fight. So wedded were their spirits, so focused were they on the fight, that even though there was an earthquake that demolished large sections of many Italian cities, made swift rivers change course, brought tidal waters up rivers, and created huge landslides on mountains, none of the combatants actually noticed it. Whatever, Livy. 6. The battle went on for some 3 hours. It was savage at every point, but around the consul the fighting was even more fierce and violent. Flaminius had his strongest troops alongside him, and he was energetically bringing assistance at any point where he had seen his men under pressure and in difficulties. His armor marked him out, and so the enemy furiously attacked him, and his own men just as furiously defended him. Then the Insumbrian horseman named Ducarius recognized the consul by his appearance. "Look," he said to his compatriots, "there's the man who cut our legions to pieces and sacked our territory and city. Now I shall make him a sacrificial offering to the shades of our fellow citizens foully slain." So saying, he put the spurs to his horse and thrust forward through the thickest of the enemy. He first cut down Flaminius' armor-bearer, who had thrown himself in the way of his charge, and then ran the consul through with his lance. The Triari raised their shields to block the man's attempt to strip the body. The event triggered the flight of most of the Romans, and now neither lake nor hill stood in the way of their panic. They ran off blindly, over ground that was nothing but ravines and cliffs, and arms and men fell tumbling over each other. most finding no passage for their flight, waded through the shallows at the edge of the lake into the deeper water, sinking up to their heads and shoulders. Some, in their unthinking panic, were prompted to attempt escape by swimming, but the distance was interminable and the effort hopeless. They drowned in the depths, or else with difficulty scrambled back to the shallows, having exhausted themselves pointlessly, for they were then butchered all along the shore by enemy horsemen who rode out into the water. About 6,000 at the head of the column had made a spirited charge through the enemy facing them, and thus managed to exit from the defile unaware of what was happening behind them. They halted on a knoll, but heard only the shouting and clash of arms, and because of the mist they could not see or know how the battle was going. It was only when the issue was decided that the sun's heat dispersed the mist and brought on the light of day. Then, in the now clear sunlight, the hills and plains revealed to them that the battle was lost, and the Roman army hideously slaughtered. Frightened of being spotted and having enemy cavalry dispatched against them, they hurriedly took up the standards and made off with all possible speed. The following day, alongside their other woes, they were facing severe hunger. However, Hannibal had caught up with them when it was still dark, and he gave them an undertaking that, if they surrendered their weapons, he would let them depart with one article of clothing each. At this the Romans capitulated, but the promise was honored by Hannibal with typical Punic scruple, and they were all clapped in irons. 7. Such was the famous battle of Trasimene. Few defeats suffered by the people of Rome have been as memorable. 15,000 Romans fell in action, 10,000 scattered in flight throughout Etruria, and headed for the city by various roads. 2,500 of the enemy died in battle, and many others succumbed to their wounds. Statistics for the fallen on both sides are many times greater in other authors. Apart from my aversion to the unfounded exaggeration to which historians are all too prone, I have myself accepted Fabius as my main source, since he was contemporary with this war. Hannibal released captives of Latin status without ransom, but Romans he put in irons. He had the corpses of his own men separated from the piles of the enemy dead, and ordered them buried. He also made every effort also to seek out Flaminius's body for burial, but he failed to find it. When news of the defeat first reached Rome, the people rushed to the Forum in sheer terror and panic. Women roamed the streets and queried these they met about the unexpected disaster and had been reported, and the fortunes of the army. Then the crowd, like some teeming assembly, turned to Comitium and the Senate House, and called upon the magistrates. Eventually, not long before sunset, the praetor Marcus Pomponius declared, "We have lost a great battle." They heard no further details from Pomponius, but they gleaned snippets of gossip from each other, and took home the news that the consul and most of his army had been killed, and that the few survivors were wandering as fugitives through Etruria, or else were prisoners of the enemy. Numerous though the misfortunes of the defeated army were, there were just as many anxieties besetting the minds of those whose relatives had been serving under the consul Gaius Flaminius. They were ignorant of what had become of their loved ones, and nobody knew what to hope for, or what to fear. The next day, on the number of days following, a crowd stood at the gates, and there were almost more women than men, waiting for one of their relatives or for news of them. They encircled new arrivals and plied them with questions, and could not be torn away from them, at least if they were acquaintances, until they had fully interrogated them on every detail. After that, as they left their informants, one might have seen the different expressions on their faces, according to whether the news each received as good or bad, and one could have seen people gathering round them as they went home, offering congratulations or sympathy. It was the woman's displays of joy and sorrow that were especially striking. They say that one suddenly came face to face with a son who had come home safely, and that he expired in his arms. A second had received a false report of her son's death and sat grieving at home, but the son returned, and she died from excessive joy at the sight of him. The praetors kept the Senate sitting in the Curia for several days, from dawn to dusk, and debated with them which commander and which troops could be used to face the triumphant Carthaginians.